Okay. The title of my talk tonight or today is Questioning Hermeneutics and Intellectual History in Medieval Islam. And this is a tentative book title under contract with Routledge. I had written this dissertation under the supervision of Professor Kevin Jakes in the Religious Studies Department. And he introduced me actually to the idea of the Tabakat, or the biographical genre that I'm going to write or publish my book about. That is a tentative title. Feel free if you think that I need to tweak this or change it. I will be happy to get your feedback towards the end. I would like to go in order, like an outline. And first I will talk about the biographical works in general, just in case if some of the audience have no idea about this, as I used to when I was in 2012. I remember Kevin asked me to go and grab a Tabakat work, and actually got him a fiqh work. And he said, wow, do you think this is Tabakat? I said, yes, I think this is Tabakat. He said, no, this is not Tabakat. So it was really a funny moment for me. It showed my ignorance, of course, but that's fine. I was learning from him. And then I introduced to the genre itself. I'll talk a little bit about the Tabakat and its usage. And I got two observations on the Tabakat in general that I found in my journey and my research. And then I had two assumptions about how people are using, or how scholars are using the Tabakat. And then I will give my conclusions, or my central argument in my book. So the origin of the Tabakat genre, and what is Tabakat? Tabakat is a plural word of Tabaqa, as mentioned by Ibrahim Hafsi. And it's often translated as class, value, generation, or a group. Interestingly, Ibrahim Hafsi is making a reference to that terminology as a Quranic word. And he made a reference to a passage in the Quran in which the word tabaqa or tabaqat is mentioned. Unfortunately, the mention or the use in the Quran has nothing to do with the genre. It just happened to be the same root. And as you know, the Arabic language has a very polysemic nature when you find one word with multiple meanings, and it depends on the context that identify it. But it's a good catch that Ibrahim Hafsi alluded to the same root, even if the meaning is slightly different. Scholar Ott Luth was one of those who wrote about the origin and the significance of the Tabakat, and he's advocating the idea of hadith genre and the Tabakat as correlated genres, and basically he thinks that the genre lies in hadith criticism. And if you are not familiar with hadith, hadith is often translated as prophetic tradition or Islamic tradition. And these traditions, each hadith or each saying or a statement has a chain of transmitters. And at the end, there is a saying or a quotation or a text. And that chain of transmissions is actually composed of a list of names. List of names are called transmitters, and these transmitters needed to be known. Who are these transmitters? And that is the idea, where the idea of listing names and certain entries about their life. Willie Hefnong actually gave a different proposal that talks about that takes the origin of the Tabakat back to the genealogy of the Arabs. Arabs were interested in genealogies, mentioning long names and tribes, and that was very common. He said genealogy and biography were together part of the interest. It was pre-Islamic Arabia practices that continued after Islam, and that was in his Encyclopedia of Islam under the word Tabakat. Ibrahim Hafsi was building on Otto Luth's proposal, and he subscribed to that idea that the Tabakat genre was actually born into Hadith genre, and they were inseparable from each other. So even if today I'll talk a little bit about the legal Tabakat, but he's crediting this to the Hadith genre, or Hadith scholars, usually referred to as traditionists or traditionalists. George Maqdisi was one of those who utilized that genre a lot in his writings. He also talked about the genre and its origin. He's in line with Hefnung, as Kevin mentioned, that he was actually influenced by Hefnung's proposal that it was part of the genealogy of the Arabs, and then he also debated the idea that it could be hadith as well. So the proposal that the hadith or the tradition of the prophetic tradition has influenced the genre was also implied in his proposal. Yet he was not really paying that much attention or worried too much about it, because he was thinking that the origin of the Tabakat is still unknown at present during his time, because many manuscripts were lost and until at that time yet was to be discovered. So it was like for him early to determine the origin of the Tabakat. Another scholar, Michael Copperson, he pointed a new thing, but he's also building on Hefnung's, that the idea of the tabaqat originated among akhbaris, and he's against the idea that it was among hadith scholars. And the word akhbaris means news reporters. It started in the Umayyad courtyard, where they are reporting stories about, of course, men. So the news were attached to events or to names. So writing or talking about names resulted in writing about these names and the production of the tabaqats in general. Tarif Khalidi actually also participated in that debate or the discussion of the origin of the tabaqat. And he mentioned that the biography was a genre which attracted diverse interests and traditions, some of which go back to pre-Islamic times. But he made another proposal, and that was the discussion about the Sufis and the Sufi orders, and how the Sufis who were interested in keeping the genealogy and the connection between Muhammad and the descendants of the Sufi orders, that connection to be started with the idea of the tabaqat, or incited or motivated the production of the tabaqat genre. Kevin Jiggs, however, does not think that the idea of Sufis was accurate. He thought that it was a misreading of Khalidi, although he does not exclude it as one of the forms of the tabaqat genre. Basically, eventually, after a while, every guild or every group of people would write their own genre or their own tabaqat production. So Kevin argues that the genre grew out of the rationalist traditionalist debate during, if you're not familiar with that debate, he's referring here to the Ash'arite, Hanbalite debate during the Inquisition and the time after. So they needed to write during that debate between the different schools, different theological schools, their followers, and that also introduced the idea of the tabaqat in general. However, I'm not really after giving you that brief background about the origin of the tabaqat, which could be described as basically a list of names that is usually organized alphabetically. Although there is a debate, and I'll show you now in the presentation, whether they are using the given name or the title, and that's kind of causing confusion here for a student who is searching these names. However, to make things simple, you think of it to be something similar to a dictionary, and that could be said about the early production of the tabaqat. With the Mamluk era, with the shift, and I'm using here a quotation from Kevin's book, that Gib mentioned that Arabic Islamic historiography embraces both annals and biography. So there was a huge shift also observed by Khalidi in the tabaqat and the use of the tabaqat. And basically, during the Mamluk era, or a little bit earlier, maybe 100 years earlier, with the introduction of Al-Khatib al-Baghdadi's work, Tarikh Baghdad, the history of Baghdad, and Tarikh Naysabur, and they tend to cast a wider net and add a lot of things into the basic entry of any biographical works, writing about everything, not only the names of the students, but they would write about everything. Khalidi concluded that biography was an emphasis here in the original quotation. It was history in the view of many of its practitioners. So Muslims during the medieval time were thinking that if your name is landed into the biographical works, that means you are part of the history. You are like the intellectual history was really matter for them, and the history of the date of death is whether it was organized by days or by, but since these all considered biographical works, intellectual history, it became like the history for those who would write biography. A quote here from Kevin's work, and a really good observation that he made. He said that in the 8th, that is corresponds to the 14th century of the Common Era, and the 9th, 15th centuries, the production of the genre increases, doubling the total number of texts produced just 2 centuries earlier, before steadily declining once again in the 10th and 16th century. So that good observation, that it shows that there is a huge shift in how that genre came to be understood by its practitioner. It is no longer a list of names and their cities or their teachers and their works. It became the history for the Muslim tradition. Why this is the case? Kevin argued that it was about defending the authority. Defending the authority for each school. They wanted to defend their madhab. There was a huge debate going on between Shafi'is and Hanbalis, between Ash'aris and Hanbalis, and I'm now using these as either legal school or theological schools of thought. But that increased the number. There is a huge production. Excuse me. So that production made me think that debate over the origin of the Tabakat is no longer significant or important. Because with that huge shift, we are not looking to at the same type of genre, although it may or may not carry the same name, but the function itself of that genre is slightly shifting and changing. Kevin and Khalidi, both of them pointed some important thing. They said that each entry would include the name, surname, then kunya, then connection to a town, a descent, a school of law, the person's particular knowledge, craft, power, position, principality. You can add to this list the works, the teachers, the students, all of these. But do not think that they were mentioned in order. There is no order for this. You might even not find the surname. You might not find the name or a kunya or a title. You might find something about the town. You might find something about the profession. But don't take this to be like the list that should be included in every entry. These are just like examples of what we call basic entry. And I want you to remember that statement here. That is the basic entry that we can find for each and every biography under their entries. That production resulted in a debate because it is taken to be literary sources. When we say literary sources here, because these authors included a huge amount of literary works, poetry, stories, anecdotes, legends, you name it. It's like not like just like telling you factual elements about each subject. They were telling you maybe an imaginative story, a dream, all that kind of thing, caused some of scholars to call it literary sources. And in fact, it is a literary source. And that literary sources caused a little bit of another debate. As I mentioned, and I'm repeating this, George Makdisi was one of those who used and utilized that source carefully to write about the education in medieval period. For example, his famous work that was widely cited and used, the Rise of College. depended primarily into two of these literary sources. One, Fatawa al-Subki, Taqi al-Din al-Subki, during the Mamluk era. He was a chief judge of the Shafi'i madhab in Damascus. And he used his fatwas or legal opinions as one of the sources for his fabulous book, The Rise of College. He also used another literary work by Taj al-Din al-Subki called Murid al-Na'am or Murid al-Niqam. And that's also a literary sources in which al-Subki is describing the model for the good schooling and the good educational system during his time. However, scholars like Jonathan Berkey, Michael Chamberlain, Defna, Efforts, in their works about education, about the rise of colleges or schools during medieval time, they kind of refuted the usage of these literary sources. They tend to say maybe using, as argued by Michael Chamberlain, the endowment records will be more accurate than just using these literary sources uh, in writing or reconstructing a moment in the past. Devin Stewart, a faithful and loyal student of George Makdisi, defended his teacher's use of literary sources and the use of Tabakat in general in his chapter, The Doctorate of Islamic Law in Mamluk Egypt and Syria. And he argued that we don't have a lot of references, a lot of sources. So using these biographical works or literary sources, as they call it, is inevitable. You cannot just avoid using them. If you want to read about the ijaza or the permission to teach, which sounded like a certificate in modern time, you will not find them except in these literary works. You will find them on the covers of these literary works. Most of the endowment records, we will find them during the Ottoman Empire more than the Mamluks or the earlier times. So we have to depend heavily on these biographical works. And I think the issue is not whether or not, and this is my, I hope to be my contribution to this discussion, is not whether or not we're going to use the literary sources, it's how we're going to use it. And that is a big thing that I hope to discuss thoroughly in my book. What I observed, and everybody's using the Tabakat should observe this as well, is we find a lot of production that carry the same title. And I'm giving here an example of, look to these two words, Tabakat al-Shafi'iyya, Tabakat al-Shafi'iyya, the generations of the Shafi'is. And we find a number of these titles there, like the generation of the Shafi'is, like Tabakat al-Fuqaha al-Shafi'iyya, the generation of the Shafi'i jurists by Ibn Salah, who died just a couple of years before the Mamluk era began. Tabakat al-Shafi'iyya al-Kubra, by the extended generation of the Shafi'is by Taj al-Din al-Subki. Tabakat al-Shafi'iyyin, this is the generation of the Shafi'is by Ibn Kathir, who was a contemporary of al-Subki, almost lived with him in the same city, and he was also a Shafi'i judge. The Tabakat al-Shafi'iyya, or the generation of the Shafi'is by Ibn Qadi Shuhba, who kind of copied a couple of volumes from Taj al-Din al-Subki's into his work with while acting and changing and editing and reinterpreting certain passages as argued by Jakes. So we see that now when we want to use any of these texts, which one we pick and why? So should we grab Tabakat al-Shafi'iyya by Ibn Salah? What would make him more significant or important than al-Subki? What would make Ibn Qadi Shuhba's work valuable? And even in today among Muslims, in a conference that was held in Chechnya to define who are the Ahl Sunnah, the partisans of the Sunnah or the tradition, or you can call it the Orthodox Muslim tradition. As-Subki was cited in that modern conference to give a contemporary definition of who are the Ahl Sunnah, or who are the Ahl Sunnah or the partisans of the prophetic tradition. So why why would someone cite a Subki but not al-Dhahabi or Ibn Kathir? And you can tell within 1 century, maybe within the same time, maybe they already know each other's work, yet they insist to call it the same name, but a different author. Another observation here, we see that many of these scholars, not so many of them, introduced their approaches to writing history at the beginning of their works. We find a lot of those in the book of etiquette, such as Ibn Abdul Barr's book, Jami' al-Bayan al-Ilm, The Explication of Knowledge Collection, and this is my translation. We find this in the introductions of their historical and biographical works as well, such as Abu al-Hajjaj al-Mizzi's work, تهذيب الكمال, revision of Kamali texts. Shams al-Din al-Dhahabi's Tarikh al-Islam, he wrote about his methodology in the history of Islam. Ibn Khaldun's Muqaddimah is obviously one of those theological, methodological works or approaches to the history in his introduction. Ibn Hajar al-Asqalani's work, Tahdhib al-Tahdhib, the revision of the revision, he wrote about his methodology or his approach to history. شمس الدين السخاوي's work, الإعلام بالتوبيخ لمن ذم أهل التاريخ, the open denunciation of the adverse critics of the historians, that was translated and commented on by Franz Rosenthal. And these works, as you can tell, each and every scholar, maybe a contemporary of each other, are trying to give us a definition of how to write history or their approaches to writing intellectual history. My point of departure and the center of my thesis in my dissertation was Taj al-Din al-Subki. So I will show you his method or his approach as a reference here. Yet in my book, I'm discussing the other authors as well. I'm putting them in conversation with each other to see how they were struggling with the idea of hermeneutics. It was not only theological, as argued by George Makdisi, although George Makdisi's argument is valid, but it was also a methodological issue that they were struggling with in writing that massive production, particularly during the Mamluk era. So he wrote a rule regarding historians, I went through these 9 prerequisites of that he listed, and he interestingly listed those under one of the entries. It's a second entry in his extended generation of the Shafi'is, and he listed these 9 prerequisites of a good historian, what he called a good historian, and basically he was trying to show his method, and that what made his book طبقات الشافعية by السبكي different from طبقات الشافعية by Ibn Kathir, for example. So he said, and I'm reading this and also translated by Rosenthal and cited as well by As-Sakhawi in his work. So he said, a historian should be honest. A historian, if he's quoting someone, he should transmit the exact wording, not the quotation or the meaning of it. A historian should not depend on his study notes. It was a common thing that they were doing when quoting someone. Maybe scribal error would happen, a lot of other reasons. A historian should mention his reference. He also continued with these, what I called or categorized as the conditions or the prerequisites of authorship. And he said, if you are a historian writing now the entry as an eyewitness or someone who is reproducing that entry, he said you should possess knowledge of the subject position. The word he's using is hal, and it's a word that is used in Sufism in many genres, but he intended to use that word for all sorts of reasons. A historian must possess excellent exposition and must understand the denotation or the meaning of verbal expressions that they are using. A historian must possess a good imagination, and that takes us to the discussion of the imagination as part of how history is written. Part of it is educated guessing, how they would imagine the life of a subject in the 2nd century, if they are writing about that's the same subject when they are in the 12th century, and so on. And he wanted them to be having that good imagination to be able to imagine the condition of the biographical subjects and describe them with precise expressions that do not add or delete part of their stories. A historian must not be overcome by prejudice. And he talked a lot about prejudice and how his contemporaries and those who wrote before him are very, very biased in their writings. And then the final one, an active imagination should be present during the writing process, because you might be angry and maybe sad. You have a fight with your wife, and then you are very angry and wrote something bad about the subject. But then when you cool down and have a good mood, then you might have said something different. And as someone who's writing myself, I would say this really impacts the way we write things, and I would agree with him on this point. Using biographical works, these are two assumptions that I observed, and one of them actually I'm building on Kevin Jicks's proposal in his wonderful discussion about authority. He actually used Tabakat Ibn Qadi Shuhba and analyzed the whole book in its entirety, applying a very unique approach to the Tabakat, while it took him a long time to read one short text, which is not possible to read that massive production with the same way that Kevin did with 2 volumes. So there is a tendency among the scholars that we use these as dictionaries. And when I say dictionaries here, because they were organized or arranged alphabetically, and with one exception, and that exception is very clear. Uh, Muhammad ibn Ismail al-Bukhari wrote his in which he listed the names of the transmitters that he used in his work. And he invented one thing that everybody else actually followed his footsteps. He started the book by the names, by those whose names are Muhammad's, and then by those whose names are Ahmad's, because these two names are one of the famous names for Prophet Muhammad. And then everybody else is arranged alphabetically. That order or that arrangement made us think that these are functioning as dictionaries. And whenever we need something from these sources, we would Google the name. But that raises a couple of issues. One, is it the given name or the title that the author is using? They varied. And you will find one author has multiple names, and I'm giving you an example here. I'll show you an example. Is it brief, very brief, succinct, biographical entry, or very extended? Selectivity was a common thing. He's a Shafi'i, but I don't like him. I'm not including him in my book. Or he's a transmitter of things that I don't agree with, so I exclude him. And dropping him from that work might dropping him from the history. You remember when I said it became like the history of that era, of that time? So these also, whether or not the criticism is mentioned under the allotted entry, under that specific name, it could be mentioned throughout the book, and I'll show an example of this. And the second assumption that we have is biographers copy previous historians' text, and that was made clearly by Jonathan Berkeley in one of his writings. He tended to say that they were just basically copying verbatimly whatever previous scholars. And we sense this actually, if you recall, Ibn Hisham and him copying a Sirah of Ibn Ishaq. He did edit. We agree that Ibn Hisham already edited and changed it and rearranged it and dropped many significant things that Ibn Ishaq included, but he refined it and proposed it in a different way that already produced a new whole or a new way of reading Muhammad's biography. The same thing is happening in the Tabaqat, and I will give you an example of interpretation and how it works. I think I still have some time. So the example that I would like to highlight with the issue of names, supposedly now with the technology, with a Shamla library, if we were to look these names, are you going to use the title, the first name, first given name, last name? Here's an example, and that caused a debate between Al-Dhahabi and his student Tajuddin al-Subki. Al-Dhahabi here is writing about Fakhr ad-Din ibn al-Khatib, known as Ibn al-Khatib al-Fakhr ad-Din al-Razi. And he included him in a very controversial work in Kitab Mizan al-I'tidal. And that book, Mizan al-I'tidal, is a book that Al-Dhahabi dedicated for those whom he trashes because he think these are criticized by others or discredited by other traditionalists or hadith collectors. So he said, Al-Fakhr ibn al-Khatib is the author of many works. He is intelligent and outstanding in rational sciences. And by the way, outstanding in rational sciences, you don't take this to be a word of praise here. He is very critical when he is giving that description. But he is empty of transmitted knowledge, the author or the hadith approach. He questioned issues that are considered among the established tenets of faith, which causes confusion to him. And that kind of usage here, may God instill faith in our hearts as if he's saying, oh, this is awful. God protect us from that, God forbid. He's the author of السير السر المكتوم في مخاطبة النجوم, the hidden secret in addressing the stars, which is a plain magic. One would hope he repented of this work. So, and that was it. He didn't say, as you can tell, he didn't say anything bad about him, with the exception of me reading that outstanding in rational sciences to be a negative or a critique, not like a word of praise. But the mere listing of him in that book, Kitab Mizan al-I'tidal, is actually a reason why he is discrediting him. And he said this clearly in the book. Anyone in this book, that means is someone who did a crime or did something wrong and was being criticized by others. That's why he ended being he ended up being here. And one thing about this criticism here, it doesn't show that any critique at all, just listing him, but also the use of his name was really crucial. So Al-Fakhr, his first name is Muhammad. And now you can tell, remember, we start the names by Muhammad, the whole list by Muhammad, then Ahmad, and then go alphabetically. So the first name was Muhammad. He did not call him Muhammad because he did not put him at the very beginning. A critique that annoyed As-Subki. He said, we never heard any biographer calling Imam Fakhr ad-Din as Fakhr, because the fa letter, the Arabic, goes at the very end of the Arabic alphabet. So he was listed towards the end of the volume. So even the position wherein the biographical subject is written, or the biographical is written, is really crucial and important for those who are interested in writing these works. So he's not happy with him being called Fakhr, like the honor or the dignity or something, which is still a good title, I would say. But he wanted him to be called Muhammad, and in this case, he will be listed at the very beginning of the book, not necessarily towards the end. He was known as Imam ibn al-Khatib, but again, his first given name is Muhammad. So why would someone like Al-Dhahabi would list him as Fakhr, to throw him towards the end? Maybe. And another thing that I observed about Al-Dhahabi's writing, he never repeat his critique in the same book. So if he said something about him under another entry, which obviously he did, he will never ever come back to the same under another entry and repeat himself. So the assumption that these writers were read in its entirety, a proposal that was made already by Kevin Jakes, and I'm emphasizing it here, is really crucial for understanding the overall assessment of the biographical entry. Although As-Subki was not happy, but you cannot find any complete entry about Fakhr al-Din in his book, Tabakat al-Shafi'i al-Kubra. Another example here, you will notice that the length of the biography is really matter. And I remember a discussion I read about the length, because those who participated in the transmission of knowledge are endless number, and it's really hard to write their names down. So it became really tough and difficult. So you will find the significant or the big names, renowned scholars, and usually you will find very long, like the Subki's father. He wrote about his father almost one volume, 200 pages about his father, wherein he wrote about someone like Abdulgawwad al-Qazwini, just 2 lines. And 2 lines, you can hardly say anything about the biographical entry when you use them as a dictionary. One of the issues is these scholars were clearly selective in what to include and what not to include in the writings. And I'm using here an example of Al-Kamali's book is very famous as Tahdhib al-Kamal, that was written by 3 different authors. Al-Kamali في أسماء الرجال was written initially by Abdulghani al-Maqdisi, is a Hanbali scholar, by the way. And he included the transmitters whose names appeared or mentioned in the 6 famous Sunni hadith collections, Al-Bukhari, Muslim, and the 4 Sunans. And then he left the text, he died. Then that text was used and extended and added to by 3 different scholars. It was actually extended by Ibn Salah, who added and edited some names, but he died before he finishes it. Then An-Nawawi participated in the book and he added certain names, but he did not complete it and died before this. And eventually it was written and published under Al-Mizzi's name, Abu al-Hajjaj al-Mizzi, as Tahdhib al-Kamal by Abu al-Hajjaj al-Mizzi. He adds other names that were not mentioned in the 6 books of hadith, but he ignored famous names that were already known, participated in the transmission of hadith, and also were within the Shafi'i school, which he belongs to as well. Yet he would disagree, as Subki would say, he would disagree with them theologically. So he ignored Al-Muzani, which is a very famous name in the Shafi'i school, Ibn Surayj, Imam al-Harawain al-Juwayni, a well-known scholar, and Ibn al-Sabbagh, among many other names. So such texts would incite other scholars to write their own works and that attribute their own selections. This is my biographical work. It's called Shafi'is, but by myself or by Subki or by Al-Dhahabi or by Ibn Kathir and so on. One of the other things that I observed in my dissertation, and also going to extend on this in my book, is the idea that acquisition is not most of the time listed under the allotted entry of the biography. Rather, they are mentioned throughout the text. And here is a clear example. We see the accusations of Al-Dhahabi, as Subki's teacher, from whom he copied 2 volumes. He did not write anything bad about him. His devastating, his accusation of intentional use of false statements to depict biographies in history are mentioned under Ahmad ibn Salih al-Misri's biographical entry, not under Al-Dhahabi's allotted entry. So you see that he is fine with him under his entry. He's saying that he's my teacher, he's a great man, and all the good names with a lot of exaggeration and a lot of Arabic literary words. But when it comes to the harsh critique, you find it under Ahmad ibn Salih al-Masri's entry. So I argue that scholars will miss As-Subki's devastating critique of Al-Dhahabi if they use As-Subki's Tabakat as a dictionary here, without reading the entire text, although it's hard to do it. They will also miss the fact that As-Subki cited Al-Dhahabi more than 200 times when he refers to him as my teacher, as Shaykh or Shaykhuna, our teacher. So he's citing him, criticizing him, and then under his entry, everything is fine. If I were to use As-Subki's work, I would definitely, and then write about Al-Dhahabi, I will miss a huge critique or a clear assessment of As-Subki to his teacher. I give you another example wherein scholars are reinterpreting the historical passages that they transmit or the quotation that they transmit, whether it was verbatimly or they act on the language, dropping certain languages or passages, ignoring them in order to provide a new understanding. I know I don't have much time, but I would just mention briefly what happened here. Al-Hakim al-Naysaburi was accused of being a Shi'i because he favored Ali ibn Abi Talib, the first Imam of Shi'ism, the Prophet's cousin and his son-in-law, over the rest of the Prophet's companions. Such accusation was reported by Al-Khatib al-Baghdadi and also Al-Dhahabi. And these two scholars, although they cited early sources, Ismail al-Harawi's quotation or accusation of him being a Shi'i, and the way they are accusing him of being Shi'i is to discredit him from being a reliable Sunni scholar or Sunni hadith collector. So these two famous scholars, Al-Khatib al-Baghdadi and Al-Dhahabi, threw in that quotation and then their own interpretation, and they said he was not actually batini. Batini was the word that was used in the original by Ismail al-Harawi. He was batini khabith. Batini khabith, like it's like a fanatic, that they would say a fanatic or non-Orthodox Shi'i. Even the Shi'is would say these are fanatics as well. But Al-Khatib al-Baghdadi and Dhabi said, no, he only Shi'i. He has Shi'i inclination in him. And this is a big critique for Sunnis when it comes to accepting his writings. But when a Subki wrote his biography, he wrote really long quotation, and I don't have time to read it for you. So I will just summarize what As-Subki did in order to avoid or reinterpret the biographical entry or the quotation, to refute what Al-Dhahabi said and to reject what Al-Khatib al-Baghdadi argued about Al-Hakim al-Naysaburi. He said, first, let's identify Al-Hakim's teachers. They were Sunnis, so none of them were accused or known to be Shi'is. Then he said, let's read his work. Does he accuse any of the Sunnis or say anything about them? He said, nothing against the Sunnis. So he's also fine. If he were even to be like a hidden Shi'i, he would definitely throw a couple of words to discredit some Sunni names. But he didn't. And then he said, read about what his contemporaries wrote about him, because you're thinking of him a Shi'i because he visited Baghdad, and because of that happy accident, Al-Khatib al-Baghdadi decided to write about him because he wrote about anyone who visited Baghdad, even if he was from Naysabur. So I think we should, according to As-Subki, accept his people, his those who were in the city with him, not someone random who wrote about him. Basically, this is an implied argument he's making. He said is a bright Sunni hadith transmitter and Ash'ari follower, and this is a key thing here, and never criticized any of his Ash'ari teachers. And As-Subki think that the Ash'aris are the Sunnis here in this argument. And then he identified those who accused him of being Shi'is, and he found there is a theological differences between them, or what is known as a colleague's talk, or Hadith al-Aqran. Hadith al-Aqran is a word that's used by scholars to reject the colleagues' attack on each other. They say, don't listen to this. It's just like, it's not uncommon to see a harsh book review written by a colleague against the same person in the same field. So in a nutshell, my main argument is that there is a methodological struggle among biographers common in the writings of Muslim intellectual history that relies on intentional selectivity and sometimes inaccurate interpretations of the biographies that was shaped by their theological and also legal commitments. Therefore, examining the biographer's hermeneutics is crucial for understanding or for a better understanding of the Tabakat genre. Again, I'm not saying we cannot use them as dictionary here. We still can find some benefits in using these literary works, huge benefits, I would say. But it's not about the use, it's about how do we approach it. Maybe a Shamla library would help us explore and dig deep and read, and compare and contrast different entries. But again, we still have to struggle to find where As-Subki used the name different from al-Dhahabi, and how and whether they were consistent. Obviously, they were not consistent as well in using the names of the biographical subjects. Thank you.
Well, thank you very much, Ossama. This was a fascinating talk. There is a gold mine out there if you're willing to dig into these biographical works. So thank you very much. We'll open the floor to questions. If you could either raise your hand or make a note of your interest in asking a question in the chat. I will attempt to identify you and unmute you. I can start. As an historian, I appreciate the methodological rules provided by some of these folks. Are there rules about selection ever explicitly articulated? Do they ever say, I'm not going to include anyone who did X, Y, or Z, or I'm not going to include people whose legal opinions I disagree with, etc.?
Yes, they are. They write like I mentioned a clear example of this Al-Kamali text. He was very obvious that he's including only the names of the transmitters in the 6 books of the collections of the Sunni Muslim tradition. So he meant to do this. He intended to do this, and this is his thing. But some names are left or abandoned. And now the question is, I'm not going to jump into the intentionality of the author here. I cannot verify it, whether it was an accident or they forget the name or they intentionally ignore the name. And that might be if someone like writing or adding, and you can tell someone would come, I like the work, but let me add to it. I like the work, let me refine it. I like the work, let me add, if they still like it. But if they think that the whole methodology is corrupt, they will write a similar work with the same title. So they did not write Tahdhib al-Kamal, they could write Tahdhib, Tahdhib, Taqrib al-Tahdhib. That work, it stayed for a while with them, and editing, revising, editing, adding, and deleting. That was an ongoing process, but that's text that they all appreciated. But when it comes to a methodology that they would disagree with, obviously they will definitely drop the whole idea and then produce something with the new interpretation. Does this answer your question, Carl?
Yes, thank you very much. Professor Jacques.
Ossama, that was a very good talk, and it's nice seeing you. It's been a while since we've talked. I hope you can hear me.
Yes, I do. Thank you, Professor Jakes.
Your list of things that Asuki mentions as sort of standards of the good hermeneut, things like being aware of prejudice and bias, and using your imagination, are things that are very, very common in modern hermeneutics and people like Gadamer or Ricoeur. And I can see in your presentation Asuki's efforts to at least criticize earlier scholars, particularly Dhahabi, for their biases. But where in the text do you see his exercise of imagination? Because this seems to me to be one of the most interesting things, because in modern hermeneutics, a lot has been done to sort of figure out how the imaginative world of the author it can be found in the text, even what might be text that you wouldn't suspect, like legal texts. But where in the Asuki do you think that there's been where he exercises imagination and trying to recreate the lives of the people in his text?
Thank you, Professor Jakes, for this wonderful question. By the way, Professor Jakes was my mentor, and he's the one that I mentioned at the very beginning, introducing me to the whole genre. Thank you for attending this session as well. I really appreciate it. Yes, I do have a chapter in my book in which I introduce Asuki or put Asuki in conversation with modern hermeneutics. I know this sounds anachronistic to some extent, and people might say, why would like a medievalist talk to a modernist and then putting things in the wrong place here. However, I hope that I will be able to make a case for that comparison. And I would see from Paul Ricoeur's discussion of the relationship between the language and the metaphor and the metaphorical language and imagination as the connection, wherein we see these biographers, including Asubki himself, would use very, very imaginative language to describe their subjects. And that would reflect how, or at least the way they want the readers to have an impression about the subject. Like when he is writing about Al-Dhahabi, and that's his teacher, he doesn't want to discredit him completely because obviously he copied two of his volumes into his work. And discrediting him completely will affect his reliability. Yet, he would use language like, if you would come to his house, you will see like a sea of humans flooding into his house. And, using that kind of metaphorical use of the language, and that creates an imagery or an image with the powerful use of the language, uh, leaves different impact on the reader compared whenever he's writing about someone in two lines, he heard from so and wrote such and such. I'm trying to establish that connection between the use of the metaphorical language, imagination, as a way wherein I think Subki was imagining the idea of imagination in his tasawwur. How would you imagine him? And then how would you describe that imagination in a language? Because at the end of the day, we want to make this into a text. Maybe if we were, and I think you, Kevin, mentioned this in your book, or maybe in a individual conversation, that some of these texts were used or memorized, particularly the short texts, and said or recited out loud. And you can say there is intonation, there is a discussion, and I can tell even when Asubki's father was telling him go and learn from Al-Mizzi, and Asubki is describing how his father was telling him to go and learn from Al-Mizzi, and he wanted to give us that imagination or that imaginative moment wherein his dad was raising his voice, and he wrote in the text that he would say a sheikh raising his voice with the word, because you might hear it from him like raising a sheikh, like he shout and say to give me a good impression. He's a sheikh or the professor. Uh, when I read, he said go to the professor is different, but he would add certain passages or certain statements where he wanted to leave that his own imagination and how he wanted to leave that impression or have that impact on the reader when they read the text. Um, yeah, thank you, Kevin, for this wonderful question. And I hope I can elaborate in this in my chapter when I put a Suki in conversation with the modern hermeneutics. Thank you.
Well, thank you. And it was a great talk, by the way. I really enjoyed it.
Thank you, Professor.
We have time for another question if anyone has one for Ossama. Otherwise, on behalf of the Center for the Study of the Middle East, let me thank you all for attending today. And thank you in particular to Ossama Abdulgawwad for your presence. It was a truly fascinating talk, and we thank you very much.
Thank you, everyone. I really appreciate it. Thank you, Hannah. Thank you, Professor Jakes. Thank you, Professor John Walbridge, and thank you, everybody, for attending this talk. Your attendance it meant a lot to me, and also your questions are helpful. Thank you.
Have a great day, everyone.